boy had only been on the stage for a few seconds when the laughter began. At first, it was only one person, then another, then another. Within moments, an entire room was laughing at a little boy who was standing beneath the brightest lights of his life. But nobody in that room knew one thing. That little boy had spent years dreaming about that exact moment, and nobody could have imagined that the man who would eventually stop the laughter would be Elvis Presley. It was supposed to be a night about discovering talent. The hall was packed. Families filled the rows. Friends leaned toward one another, whispering excitedly. Contestants waited nervously behind the curtain, each hoping that tonight might be the night somebody finally noticed them. On stage, the lights burned brightly. A microphone stood alone in the center. To most people, it was simply part of the show. But to one little boy sitting near the back of the room, that microphone represented everything. He had been watching it all evening. Every time someone walked onto the stage, he imagined himself taking their place. He imagined the lights shining on him. He imagined opening his mouth and hearing his voice fill the room. Most of all, he imagined people clapping. The boy wasn't famous. He wasn't trained. He didn't have expensive clothes. He didn't have a manager. He didn't even have the confidence of the other contestants. He only had a dream. And sometimes, a dream is all a child needs to believe that something bigger is waiting for him. Finally, he couldn't sit still anymore. He stood. His legs were trembling. He looked toward the stage, then toward the organizer. He took a deep breath and walked forward. When he reached the front, he stopped. "Excuse me." The organizer looked down. "Yes?" The boy swallowed. "Can I sing?" The organizer looked at him for a moment, then smiled. Not kindly, almost dismissively. "You?" The boy nodded. "Yes." A few people nearby heard the conversation. Someone smiled, someone else chuckled. The boy didn't notice. He was too focused on the answer. "I just want one chance," he said. The organizer shook his head. "This competition is not a playground." The boy's smile disappeared. "I know. You're too young." "I can try." "You're not ready." The boy looked at the microphone, then back at the organizer. "What if I make a mistake?" The organizer answered without hesitation. "Then you'll embarrass yourself." The boy went silent. Those words stayed with him. He lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he might cry, but he didn't. He simply nodded. "Okay." Then he turned around and walked away, slowly. His shoulders were lower than before. He returned to his seat, but he didn't stop looking at the stage. That was the strange thing. Even after being rejected, he still watched. Because sometimes people can tell you that your dream is impossible, but they can't make you stop wanting it. The competition continued. A singer walked onto the stage. The audience applauded. Another contestant performed. More applause. The boy watched every performance. His lips moved silently as he tried to follow the songs. "Maybe one day," he thought. "Maybe one day I'll be brave enough." Then the doors at the back of the hall opened. Nobody expected what happened next. A man walked inside. At first, only a few people noticed. Then heads began turning. Whispers spread across the room. People stood. The atmosphere changed instantly. "Elvis." Someone said it quietly. Then another voice repeated it. "That's Elvis Presley." The name traveled through the hall like electricity. The king of rock and roll had entered the building. Elvis didn't need an introduction. He didn't need an announcement. The moment people recognized him, the room erupted. People smiled. People pointed. Some tried to get closer. But Elvis wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking across the room. And then he saw the boy. Everyone else was looking at Elvis. Elvis was looking at the child. The boy was sitting alone. His head was lowered. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't trying to get Elvis's attention. He didn't even seem to care that Elvis was there. Elvis noticed. He slowly walked toward him. The people around him became quiet. When Elvis reached the boy, he stopped. "Hey, son." The boy looked up. His eyes widened. For a second, he couldn't speak. Elvis smiled. "You okay?" The boy nodded, but Elvis could see that he wasn't. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Elvis tilted his head. "That's not a very convincing nothing." The boy looked toward the stage. Elvis followed his eyes. Then the boy finally said it. "I wanted to sing." Elvis looked back at him. "You wanted to sing?" The boy nodded. "They wouldn't let me." Elvis's expression changed. "Why?" The boy shrugged. "They said I'm not good enough." For a moment, Elvis said nothing. He looked at the stage, then at the organizer, then back at the boy. "What makes them think you're not good enough?" The boy didn't answer because he didn't know. Maybe they were right. Maybe he really wasn't good enough. Maybe dreams were only for people who already had talent. Maybe that microphone would always belong to somebody else. Elvis turned toward the organizer. "Why didn't you let him sing?" The organizer walked over. "He's too young." Elvis waited. The organizer continued. "He doesn't have the ability." Elvis looked at the boy, then back at the organizer. "So?" The organizer looked confused. "So what?" "So let him try." The organizer shook his head. "This is a competition." Elvis nodded. "I know." "He could ruin the performance." Elvis smiled slightly. "It's one performance." The organizer hesitated. Elvis looked toward the boy. Then he said something that instantly changed the atmosphere. "Let him on stage." The boy's head snapped upward. "What?" Elvis smiled. "You heard me." The organizer still looked uncertain. "But he could—" "Let him try." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The organizer finally stepped aside. The boy stood. His heart was pounding. Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't think about all those people." The boy looked toward the crowd. There were hundreds of them. "How can I not?" Elvis smiled. "Because they're not the ones singing." The boy took a breath. Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "You are." The boy nodded. Then he walked toward the stage. Every step felt like walking into a storm. He climbed the stairs. The crowd became quiet. He reached the microphone. His hands were already shaking. He looked out. Hundreds of faces. Some curious, some amused, some already expecting him to fail. He looked toward Elvis. Elvis gave him one small nod. "Go." The music began. The boy opened his mouth, and the first note came out. Weak, unsteady, almost swallowed by the sound of the room. He tried again. This time, the note came out wrong. A laugh came from somewhere in the audience. The boy froze. Another laugh, then another. His face turned red. He looked down. He tried again. His voice cracked. The laughter grew louder. Some people weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The boy's fingers tightened around the microphone. His eyes began to fill with tears. He looked toward the side of the stage. Elvis was still standing there, watching. The boy looked back at the crowd, and for a moment, he was no longer a singer. He was just a frightened child surrounded by hundreds of people who had decided he wasn't good enough. He lowered the microphone. He was going to leave. Then someone laughed louder than everyone else. The boy flinched. His eyes dropped. One tear rolled down his cheek, and that was the moment Elvis moved. His chair scraped against the floor. He stood. The laughter slowly disappeared. Elvis walked toward the stage. His face was no longer smiling. The boy looked up. Elvis stepped into the light. Then he turned toward the audience. Nobody knew what he was going to say, but everyone knew. Something had changed. Elvis looked across the hall. Then, in a voice so calm that it somehow sounded even more powerful, he asked, "Why are you laughing?" Silence. Absolute silence. The boy stared at him. Elvis took another step. "Why?" Nobody answered. He looked toward the people who had laughed. What did he do? Nothing. He came up here. Elvis pointed toward the boy. He stood in front of all of you. His voice became firmer. He was scared. A pause, but he still came. The hall remained silent. Elvis looked around. Tell me something. He waited. Who in this room was perfect the first time they tried? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Elvis slowly nodded. Exactly. Then he looked directly at the people who had laughed. So why are you laughing at a child for doing the one thing most of you were too afraid to do? The room went completely still. The boy's tears continued falling. But now, they were different tears. Because for the first time that night, someone had seen him. Not as a bad singer. Not as a child who didn't belong on the stage. Not as somebody who wasn't ready. But as someone brave enough to try. Elvis turned toward him. He walked closer. Then he lowered himself until he was at the boy's eye level. Listen to me. The boy looked at him. You don't have to be perfect. The boy wiped his cheek. Elvis continued. You don't even have to be good. The boy looked confused. Elvis smiled. But you have to be brave enough to finish what you started. Then Elvis stood. He gently placed the microphone back into the boy's hands. The room was silent. Elvis stepped away. The boy looked at the microphone, then at the audience, then at Elvis. His hands were still shaking.
His voice was still imperfect, and the crowd was still watching. But this time, nobody was laughing. The music began again. The boy took one deep breath. He opened his mouth and began to sing. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the performance anyone expected. But somewhere between the first trembling note and the last, something extraordinary happened. The audience stopped listening for mistakes. They started listening to the courage behind the voice. And just when the boy reached the hardest part of the song, his voice suddenly disappeared. He froze. His eyes widened. He had forgotten the words. The hall held its breath. The boy looked toward Elvis, and Elvis did something nobody expected. Because instead of rescuing the boy, he stepped back. He wanted the child to discover something for himself. The boy stood alone beneath the lights, and for the first time that night, the entire room was waiting to see whether he would give up or keep going.
The boy stood beneath the lights, and for the first time that night, the entire room was waiting for him. Not waiting to laugh, not waiting to see him fail. Waiting. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the microphone. His chest rose and fell quickly. He had forgotten the next line. Every second felt like an eternity. He looked at the audience. Hundreds of faces. Then he looked toward Elvis. Elvis didn't move. He didn't rush toward him. He didn't whisper the words. He simply stood there, watching, believing. The boy took a slow breath, then another. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he remembered. One word, then another. He began again. His voice was still shaky, still imperfect, but this time, something was different. There was no panic behind it. There was courage. The first few notes were quiet, almost fragile. But as the song continued, his voice became stronger. A woman in the front row leaned forward. A man who had been laughing earlier lowered his head. Someone stopped whispering. The hall became so quiet that the boy could hear his own breathing between the lines. He reached the next part of the song. His voice cracked. He stopped for half a second. The old fear returned. He looked toward the crowd. Was someone going to laugh again? Nobody did. Instead, someone clapped. Just once. A small sound, almost invisible. The boy looked toward the person who had done it. Then another person joined. Clap. Then another. Clap. Then another.
The sound slowly spread through the room. The boy's eyes widened. He wasn't being laughed at. They were encouraging him. His lips trembled. He continued singing. And this time, he wasn't singing because Elvis had told him to. He was singing because he wanted to. Something inside him had changed. A few minutes earlier, he had been trying to survive the stage. Now, he was beginning to own it. The final part of the song approached. His voice became emotional. He wasn't technically perfect, but every word carried something real. Fear, hope, embarrassment, and the desperate desire to prove to himself that he could finish what he started. Then came the final note. The boy held it as long as he could, and finally, silence. He lowered the microphone. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do. The boy looked terrified. He thought perhaps the applause wasn't coming. Then one person stood, clapping. Another stood. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted. The applause became deafening. The boy stared at the crowd. His mouth opened slightly. He couldn't believe it. A few minutes earlier, those same people had laughed at him. Now they were standing, clapping, cheering. Some were smiling. Some were wiping their eyes. The boy's face crumpled. He began to cry. But this time, he wasn't crying because he wanted to escape. He was crying because he had stayed. He had finished. Elvis watched from the side of the stage. A small smile appeared on his face. The boy looked toward him. Elvis nodded. Not a celebrity's nod, not a performer's nod. A man's nod to a child who had just done something difficult. The boy stepped away from the microphone. But before he could leave the stage, Elvis walked toward him. The applause slowly became quieter. Elvis stood beside him. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Then he turned toward the audience. "You see that?" The hall became quiet again. Elvis pointed toward the boy. "That is courage." The boy looked down. Elvis continued. "Not being perfect." He paused. "Not having the best voice." Another pause. "Courage is standing here after people laughed at you and deciding to finish anyway." The room listened. Every person, every row, every seat. Elvis turned toward the organizer. "You almost didn't let him sing." The organizer lowered his eyes. Elvis wasn't angry, but his words carried weight. "Imagine if you had sent him home." He looked toward the boy. "He might have believed you." The organizer said nothing. Elvis looked back at the audience. And that's the dangerous thing about laughing at someone who is still learning. The hall was silent. "You don't know what you're destroying." Those words hit differently. A woman in the front row lowered her head. The man who had laughed earlier looked uncomfortable. Elvis continued. "Maybe you think you're just making a joke." He looked around. "But that child might hear your laughter for the next 10 years. Silence. He might remember it every time he wants to try something new." Elvis looked at the boy again. "And one day," he paused, "he might stop trying altogether." The boy's eyes filled with tears again. Elvis put his hand on his shoulder. "That is why you have to be careful with people." The room remained completely still. Then Elvis looked toward the crowd. "Because you never know what somebody is carrying inside." Nobody laughed now. Nobody even moved.
The boy looked at the floor. Then Elvis crouched beside him again. "You know what I liked most about that?" The boy shook his head. "You kept going." The boy smiled through his tears. Elvis smiled back. "That's something nobody can teach you." Then the organizer stepped forward. He looked embarrassed. "I was wrong." The boy looked up. The organizer continued, "I should have let you try." The boy didn't know what to say. Elvis gently nodded toward him. "Go ahead." The boy whispered, "Thank you." The organizer nodded. Then came something unexpected. A man from the audience stood. He had been one of the people laughing earlier. He looked toward the boy. "I owe you an apology." The boy stared at him. The man continued, "I laughed because I thought you were going to be terrible." He took a breath. "But you reminded me of something." The room waited. "I was afraid to sing when I was your age." The man smiled sadly. "And I never tried." The boy's expression changed. The man sat down. Another person stood. Then another. People began sharing small stories about dreams they had abandoned, about things they were afraid to try, about moments when someone had laughed at them. The competition had changed. It was no longer about who could sing the best. It had become something much bigger. The boy had walked onto the stage believing he was the weakest person in the room. Now, everyone was discovering that they had their own fears. Elvis watched quietly. Then he turned toward the boy. "Do you still want to sing?" The boy nodded. "Yes." Elvis smiled. "Good." The boy asked, "Do you think I can become a good singer?" Elvis looked at him for a moment, then answered honestly, "I don't know." The boy's smile faded slightly, but Elvis continued, "And neither does anybody else." The boy looked confused. Elvis leaned closer. "That's the point. You don't know what you're capable of until you keep trying." The boy nodded slowly. Then Elvis said something that would stay with him forever. "Don't chase applause." The boy listened. "Chase the person you could become." The words hung in the air. Then the band began preparing for the next performance. The competition was supposed to continue, but nobody was thinking about the scores anymore. The boy stepped off the stage. He walked toward his seat. People smiled at him. Some nodded. A few reached out and touched his shoulder as he passed. He was no longer invisible. But then, just as he reached the aisle, Elvis called his name. The boy turned around. Elvis was holding something, a small piece of paper. The boy walked back. "What is it?" Elvis handed it to him. "Something for later." The boy looked at the paper. He didn't understand. "What does it say?" Elvis smiled. "You'll know when the time comes." The boy carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket. Then Elvis leaned toward him. "One more thing." "Yes?" "Don't let tonight be the best night of your life." The boy stared at him. Elvis smiled. "Make it the beginning." The boy nodded. He walked away. But neither of them knew that the little piece of paper in that boy's pocket would matter far more than anyone in that hall could possibly imagine. Because the night wasn't over, not even close. And before the lights went out, the boy was about to discover why Elvis had chosen to believe in him.
The hall was still filled with applause when the boy returned to his seat. But he wasn't the same boy who had stood there an hour earlier. He had walked onto that stage believing that everyone was waiting for him to fail. Now he understood something. Sometimes the hardest person to prove yourself to is yourself. He sat down quietly. His hands were still trembling. His heart was still beating fast. But there was something new in his eyes. Confidence. Not the loud kind, not arrogance. Something much more powerful. Belief. Across the room, Elvis watched him. Then the competition continued. Another singer performed. Then another. But the atmosphere had changed. People weren't laughing at mistakes anymore. They were listening. They were encouraging. Every nervous contestant received applause. Every missed note was followed by another chance. The boy watched all of it. And somewhere deep inside, he realized that maybe Elvis hadn't just defended him. Maybe Elvis had changed the entire room. But then the organizer stepped onto the stage. He looked toward the audience, then toward the contestants. There is one more thing. The room became quiet. He looked at the little boy. I think we made a mistake tonight. The boy looked up. The organizer continued. This competition was supposed to be about finding talent. He paused. But tonight, someone reminded us that talent isn't the only thing that matters. He looked directly at the boy. Sometimes, courage matters more. The crowd applauded. The boy lowered his head. He didn't know where to look. Then the organizer said something unexpected. There will be no elimination tonight. The audience murmured. The organizer smiled. Everyone who came here and had the courage to stand on this stage has already accomplished something. The crowd applauded again, but the boy wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the piece of paper in his pocket. He reached inside, slowly unfolded it. There were only a few words written on it. He read them. Then he looked toward Elvis. Elvis was standing near the exit. The boy immediately stood. He wanted to thank him. He hurried through the crowd, but by the time he reached the doors, Elvis was already outside. The boy ran after him. Mr. Presley! Elvis stopped. He turned around. The boy stood there, breathing heavily. You're leaving? Elvis smiled. Eventually, everybody has to. The boy held up the paper. Why did you give me this? Elvis looked at it, then at the boy. Because I wanted you to remember something. The boy waited. Elvis pointed toward the paper. Read it again. The boy looked down. The message was simple. Don't let one bad moment decide who you become. The boy looked up. Elvis continued. Tonight, you thought everybody was laughing because you weren't good enough. The boy nodded. But that's not what tonight was really about. Elvis stepped closer. Tonight was about whether you would let their laughter become your future. The boy's eyes filled with tears. Elvis gently placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. You didn't. The boy smiled. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the boy asked the question children sometimes ask when they desperately need an answer. Do you really think I can become a singer? Elvis looked at him. This time, he didn't answer immediately. He thought about it. Then he said, I think you can become whatever you're willing to work for. The boy nodded. But what if people laugh again? Elvis smiled. They probably will. The boy looked surprised. Elvis continued. People laugh at things they don't understand. He paused. Sometimes they laugh because they're afraid you'll succeed. The boy looked down at the paper. What should I do? Elvis answered simply, keep singing. The boy smiled. Then Elvis added, and if your voice shakes, keep singing. If you make a mistake, keep singing. If somebody tells you that you're not good enough, Elvis looked directly into his eyes. Work until you don't need their permission anymore. The boy's face changed. Those words reached deeper than any applause could. He nodded. Okay. Elvis smiled. Good. Then the boy suddenly hugged him. Elvis looked surprised for a moment. Then he placed his arms around the child. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but for that little boy, it meant everything. When they separated, Elvis looked toward the hall. You should go back inside. Why? Because your night isn't finished. The boy turned. What do you mean? Elvis smiled. You'll see. The boy ran back into the hall. Elvis remained outside, watching, waiting. Inside, the boy returned to his seat. Then the lights suddenly dimmed. The audience became quiet. A spotlight appeared on the stage. The organizer walked to the microphone. We have one final performance tonight. The boy looked confused. He hadn't volunteered. He looked around. Then the organizer smiled. This time, nobody is being judged. The crowd became silent. We simply want to hear something. The boy's heart began racing. The organizer looked directly at him. Would you come back to the stage? The boy froze. People around him began smiling. Someone gently pushed him forward. He stood. He walked toward the stage again. But this time, his steps were different. He wasn't walking like a frightened child. He was walking like someone who had survived the moment he thought would destroy him. He climbed the stairs. The microphone waited. The lights came on. He stood in the center. And for the first time, he wasn't looking for Elvis. He was looking at himself. He took a deep breath. Then he began. His voice wasn't perfect, but it was stronger, clearer, braver. The audience listened. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. The boy reached the middle of the song. He remembered the moment earlier when he had forgotten the words. He remembered the laughter, the tears, the shaking hands. Then he remembered Elvis's voice. Keep going. So he did. He finished the song. The final note disappeared into the hall. Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then the entire room stood. The applause exploded. The boy looked around in disbelief. People were cheering. Some were crying. The organizer was applauding. The man who had laughed earlier was standing too. And near the back doors, Elvis was there. The boy saw him. Elvis didn't clap loudly. He simply smiled. Then he raised one hand, a small gesture. Keep going. The boy smiled through his tears. He understood. The applause wasn't the important part. The important part was that he had stood there again, after being rejected, after being laughed at, after wanting to run away. He had come back. And that was the victory. The boy stepped away from the microphone. The organizer approached him. You know something? The boy looked up. What? You didn't win the competition. The boy smiled slightly. I know. The organizer smiled. But I don't think anyone here will forget you. The boy looked toward Elvis. Neither of them needed to say anything, because everyone in that room understood what had happened. Elvis hadn't given the boy fame. He hadn't given him a perfect voice. He hadn't promised him success. He had given him something much more valuable, a reason not to give up. Years later, the boy would still remember that night, not because he had sung perfectly. He hadn't. Not because everyone applauded. They eventually did. And not because Elvis Presley had walked into the room, but because at the exact moment when a frightened child was about to believe that he wasn't good enough, one man stood up and said, "Why are you laughing?" That question changed the room. But more importantly, it changed the boy. Because sometimes a person doesn't need someone to tell them that they're talented. They need someone to tell them that they're allowed to try. They need someone to stand beside them when everyone else is laughing. They need someone to say, "Get back up." And sometimes, that one moment of belief can become the beginning of an entirely different life. The boy had walked into that hall carrying a dream. He almost walked out carrying shame. Instead, he walked out carrying courage. And Elvis? He walked away knowing he had done something far more important than entertaining a crowd. He had protected a child's dream. The lights inside the hall slowly went dark. The crowd began to leave. The stage became empty. The microphone stood alone beneath the fading light. But somewhere outside, a little boy was walking home with a folded piece of paper in his pocket. He looked down at it one more time. The words were still there. Don't let one bad moment decide who you become. He folded the paper carefully and put it back into his pocket. Then he looked up at the night sky and smiled. Because tomorrow he would sing again. Not because he knew he would be great, not because he knew people would applaud, but because now he knew something he had never known before. His voice didn't have to be perfect to be worth hearing. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson Elvis Presley could have given him. Because the world is full of people who are afraid to step onto the stage. People who have dreams but are terrified of being judged. People who have talent but never discover it because someone laughed at them once. And sometimes, all it takes to change their life is one person willing to stand up and say, "Let him try." That night, Elvis gave a little boy a microphone. But what he really gave him was courage. And courage can be louder than any voice in the world.